Hi, and welcome to episode 6 of Off the Shelf, where I talk about books on my bookshelf. And in today's review, I'm doing something slightly different. So, what I hope is a more structured video essay about my thoughts on this book, which is Elizabeth Gouge, The Little White Horse. This Elizabeth Gouge, I don't actually know much about her beyond what I read off Wikipedia, and I can barely remember it. She was a Christian socialist whose religion came very prominently in her children's stories, and some of them are said to have aged well, and some of them have not. So as such, I should probably point out my own personal background is I've always had a copy of this book from a young age. And because of that, it's actually been a comfort read, and I don't know anything about the author and her sensibilities beyond what I've already said. And so the most noticeable thing about this is that it was published in 1944, and the narrative is set in 1844, a century earlier. And so in the Victorian era. So the story follows, part 1, the plot. The story follows a young girl called Maria Merriweather, who at 13 years old, her father has just died, so she and her governess and her pet dog, they have to move to the countryside to be under the guardianship of her distant cousin, Sir Benjamin Merriweather. And she moves to Moonacre Valley, which is this beautiful valley with a village called Silvery Dew, and it's surrounded by giant pine forests. And there is this park and a hill where sheep are kept called Paradise Hill. And of course, Moonacre Manor, where that resembles a castle, and she lives in a room in a tower. And the plot of the story is about her uncovering the mysteries with her childhood friend Robin, who she befriended through weird metaphysics, and having to deal with her family's enemy clan, the Dinuars, who live in the pine forest and are thieves and generally make themselves a nuisance to the villagers of Silvery Dew. And so, in so doing so, Maria, she rescues an injured hare. She meets various people around the house, including Marmaduke Scarlet and Zachariah the cat. And in the village, she meets the old parson, who is, of course, the parson, and she has lots of adventures and often rides her pet pony, Periwinkle, to achieve her objective. So it's very much she assumes the identity of a moon princess, which is what the villagers in the valley call a young woman of every Merriweather family of every generation, as there is quite a sprawling family tree, which becomes plot relevant. So it's very much a book that has a lot of young adult fairy tale energy, and as a kid I really liked that. And the descriptions, one thing I will say is the prose is still as good as I remember it, as it's really good, it's really detailed, and you get a really good sense of place through the descriptions of Moonacre Valley, the ponies, what Maria's wearing, the scrumptious food. That is really good, so I think if you want an idea of evocative language, this one might actually be a really good read. However, there's a lot looking back that I very much feel like does not age well. So one of my more favourite parts of the series is the animal companions. Out of all the characters in the book, I think they have aged the most well. As to start off with, there's her dog, who is called Wiggins. So he is a beautiful Cocker Spaniel and there's often this running gag through the narrative where his beauty is remarked upon, yet his actual character is kind of left wanting, which I actually found quite funny as a kid because dogs are supposed to be man's loyal best friend, and you have a dog who's lazy and greedy and just loves food. There's also Rolf, who is an actual lion. He's a golden lion that is referred to as a dog throughout the book until the emotional moment where it's really important to Maria's arc, and like, oh my goodness, is that a lion? And that is really silly, which again, I think is done somewhat well, although it is hard to adapt. And then there's Serena, the hare, who very much acts as a guide, and she just hops around, and she's very much used as a symbol of why they need to make peace, because that is coming to harm both on the animals and the humans in the valley. So there's also a really interesting dialogue on her introduction between the differences between rabbits and hares are these noble fairy-like creatures, whilst rabbits are just jolly little pets. I think they're referred to in the narrative. So that is actually quite interesting to how animals are viewed as something that's needed to achieve some kind of harmony. And the focus on them is actually pretty good and shows why we need to look after the wildlife. And there's also Periwinkle, Joy of the Ground, a small grey pony who does give me horse girl feels, although I will note I'll be continually annoyed about how Maria, she's just taught to ride safely in about 2 hours. She's great, and it just never comes up. I do think that is one of my first criticism of the narrative is that is not how horse riding works. Horse riding is a skill that is really hard, and you have to work really hard on balance and on posture and on using the reins just to be able to communicate well to the horse and ride the horse well in a manner that doesn't hurt them. Or like, I've ridden Rhineful ponies who just refuse to do anything because they're just so used to these annoying people who ride badly. So, admittedly, then of course, looking back on the things that haven't aged well is Robin. So Robin, compared to the higher class Maria, is essentially a shepherd boy who lives in a cave with his mother. And the reason that character hasn't aged well is because he is there is an age gap. He's, I think, 14 or 15 compared to the younger Maria. So the reason he and Maria are childhood friends, despite never meeting, is because when Robin would fall asleep, he would be transported into the garden and Maria's house in London. And as children, they would play together. This is never really explained, so I guess it's an interesting prompt for a soulmate fanfic, is probably the main takeaway. But the reason his hasn't aged badly is because of two things. Cousin marriage, and he is shown to be very controlling and jealous, to the point where, at 14 years old, there is a moment in the novel where Maria tries on Loveday's, his mother's dress, and he threatens to murder any other man she's interested in. And really very violently. And while Maria does have a temper herself, it's very much a case of just being a bit uppity in this scene, somewhat teasing, and he takes it a bit too far. And obviously, he does end up marrying her when she is a teenager, when she is, I believe, 16, and he would be 17 or 18. And obviously, the topic of child marriage is a difficult one. And one thing I should note, this is not historically accurate at all. So, in the Victorian era, women in their 20s, they often married in their 20s, often from the age of 22, I think, to about 28 at the very least. So the idea that this marriage is essentially normalized is because this is a very heavily religious book, of which I will go on to explain. However, one thing it has been found is young marriage in communities, in highly religious communities, such as Christian fundamentalist cults in America, is that when these women marry young, it essentially leaves them unable to lead a cult lifestyle where they themselves are uneducated. And I think, as someone who is older and has walked away from Christianity for my own reasons, it leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Because obviously, do I think you can meet the person you'll love for the rest of your life or marry in childhood? That itself is very possible, even if it's not the most common. Like, it is a thing. However, having this happen in this book, because Robin himself is shown to be very possessive, and it's very much a case where Maria doesn't have a chance to grow as a person without Robin always being there, because he was her only friend during childhood, and he'd never known if she makes other friends, even male or female, even beyond her mother-in-law. So it very much feels like by marrying him, she's locked into a sort of cult-like scenario. Or at the very least, that's one way you can read it as an adult. Although, do I believe that that's accurate or what the author intended? No. So it's also, I think, disturbing because I don't think that is a message we should be pushing towards young women. Obviously, it does happen, and people do choose to get married at 18, 19 for their own reasons, but in this case, it very much feels as though it's just something the author thought was a happy ending because she eventually goes on to have 10 children with Robin. And today, that does leave a sour note because, again, that's very much restricted gender roles, and Maria just doesn't grow outside of that. Even so, there's that. So, obviously, I should also expand on the other reason why I don't think much of the pairing is the incest. More specifically, it's revealed later on in the novel, I think around the midpoint, that Loveday's husband, Robin's father, whilst he's dead, Loveday is Sir Benjamin's cousin, which means that him and Maria are second cousins, because Loveday's father, Sir Benjamin's father, and Maria's grandfather were brothers. So, yeah, it's essentially, according to this family tree, my camera's a bit bad, isn't it? According to this family tree I've shown, it's very much cousin incest, and in today's world, whilst cousin marriage is a thing across many cultures, there's, as our understanding of both our own genetics and how we view society, the idea of it has very much seen as just a thing we don't do. So yeah, it was a thing, but it definitely feels weird. And also, Maria's primary father figure, so Benjamin, also marries Loveday, although by this point they don't are too old to have any children. It's very much a case of, once again, Maria and her love interest Robin feel way too close together, and it very much feels like there isn't any kind of distance, that they're both, again, it makes sense for narrative reasons, but it very much feels so as what we understand to be romantically healthy. Again, they're just too close. And it's like Maria has not known any life outside of this boy. So I do think that bothers me as an adult, even if I find it hard to fully formulate why. Also, of course, is that the way Christian spirituality is portrayed. It's from the first book, chapter in the novel, with the mention that Miss Heliotrope is reading her late father's sermons, and because of that, it's just always there. They link and gain forgiveness to how they interpret the Christian faith, and the moral authority in the novel is the old parson, who apparently used to be an atheist and was part of the French Revolution, or at the very least, actually no, the timeline hasn't quite aligned, but he was very much part of that kind of thought. And one day there was a storm, he fell off a horse, bonked his head, rose up as a man of God, literally, which is not quite how it works. So often I will note, having read the stories of people who are atheists online, that while often a lot of atheists are former Christians who didn't believe in any kind of deity and rejected divine claims, often through hours of research. So it very much feels like a prejudiced attack on atheists and unrealistic. And whilst the idea of an atheist becoming a Christian theist does happen, it is quite rare. So it very much feels like a wishful thinking, at the very least, and unrealistic, and also emblematic of this novel's inability to view non-Christian or viewpoints, which obviously Christian socialists writing religious themes, but it's very over the top. The Christianity is very over the top, and as an adult, that can be annoying to read and does make it hard to recommend, because you kind of have to be a disclaimer, this is really, really Christian. And obviously, as a children's book, that if you're a parent reading it to your child is obvious, might be a point of concern, because you yourself may not be Christian, or you would disagree with theology taught in this, not like endorsed, because it might be really unhealthy. Or not even you're a different Christian, more progressive Christianity, and just think that it's unhealthy as well. So it's very one note. It's often the spirituality. It's very much this idea of the moral authority and this idea of forgiveness, and there's sort of a law and order to things. So you're put on place to do these things, which kind of is the whole precipice, not precipice, as I do know too. So the entire concept of the novel that drives the plot as for why Maria is the Moon Princess, it's very much a case of she's the one who has to make peace because she has a moral duty derived from the fact she is the Moon Princess. And whilst obviously at the very least half of it is because she needs to stop her own family's unhealthy cycle, it is tied to the fact that she is thought to have had a destiny given to her by God. So a sort of subtle usage of the chosen one trope, which is, it's not the weirdest thing about this novel in my opinion. And obviously, so it's very much a case where it's often comes across as quite simplistic as the idea of falling in love. As often it's very much the men are the moral authority, and it's often weird because this novel, the way it has described the Dinois family, has xenophobic undertones. One thing I should know is the way the novel approaches race is there are no mention of any other people of colour, and whilst it doesn't mention the colony, the imperialism, or any colonised parts by England, there is very much the glorification of the Queen Victoria, not Queen Liz, and as such, that is just never questioned because essentially the whole plot of the novel was put forth by the men, by the people in power, essentially the Dinois family, who are nobles, or at very least they descend from a noble guy, and the Merryweathers, who were essentially, they're not actually from the area, but during the 16th century, the first Merryweather, Sir Rolf, who's of Norse descent, he apparently was just given this sack of land in the valley, and he eventually just wanted to own it all, and he was just really greedy. And the whole feud started was because Sir Rolf married the daughter of the Dinois, and as a ploy to gain land, because when the Mr. Dinois died, it would be inherited by his daughter's husband. However, the first Moon Princess, when she figured this out, and because things got tense between her father and her husband, she basically just ran away, which, okay, fine. She's often seen to be in the wrong, and where I think she was in the wrong was not for leaving this, because she essentially been lied to by her husband. She thought she married him for love. Nope, turned out he was just being greedy. Was the part where she abandoned her son. And for me, I would probably point out that's the thing I think she was wrong for. The fact that she essentially abandoned her infant child. Yes, he's a noble, he would have been well cared for. Also, the reason the fighting continued was after his daughter married Mr. Dinois, he married another much younger woman and had another son. This son was thought to have died, but it turned out he didn't after he disappeared. She ran away back to her family, and so the Moon Princess's son and her nephew, the first one, they sort of continued the feud. So the reason where I think it gets xenophobic is there's sort of weird language that describes the Dinois family. They're noted for having black hair and black eyes or brown eyes and swallow skin, whilst Maria and the Merryweathers are sort of the ivory type tone. Whilst, well, Maria is, but their features are often singled out, as well as the fact they dress all in black. And the fact they have a French name compared to the English Merryweathers, it very much feels like to me that there is a xenophobic and somewhat undertone here. I'm not sure if I would call it racist because it's two white people, but the people who are not from that place and don't seem to have made an attempt to assimilate in the culture, because there isn't anything wrong with the Noirs lifestyle. Like, their actions are wrong, but the fact they dress all in black, have a cockerel's symbol and a French name, and the fact they look slightly possibly different to the English people. I mean, French people and English people sort of look similar. Like, visually there aren't any differences. It's just kind of yikes to read about as well. The other thing I would probably talk about are swallow skin, and they're very much not humanized, which compared to the Merryweathers, who, yes, he's shown as noble, but it's only because Maria fulfills a really obscure conditions where essentially the climax of the novel, again, which is very Christian, it's only through seeing like an actual miracle, namely they see this little white horse, a unicorn, a miraculous sign, does he agree that they shouldn't be fighting, and so it sort of ties it back to Christian spirituality, is sort of weird. Like, yeah, it is a children's novel, but it's kind of like, also the way he makes amends is by subjugating himself, well, is assuming a more servile position to the Merryweathers when actually it was both their fault. So I guess I don't particularly like that, and it does bother me because the class system, which it's the people in power, the Merryweathers, they're always shown to be in the right. Yes, they're shown to be horrible people, and their bad tempers have assumed tragedy for unknown generations because the Moon Princesses, they always leave the valley. Well, they leave the manor. They usually come back to the valley as shown with Loveday, as she basically lives in a cave system. They're very nice caves, and a central part is giving things back to God, which once again, the idea of communal ownership is sort of tied up with the religious, because they give back Paradise Hill, they rededicate it, and it's by then it's seen as fine. So there's the villagers are portrayed as one note. They're shown as essentially being happy, and happy that the local lord is essentially a good feudal overseer, when in reality the local lord, being bad at his job, is what's literally causing them problems. And it also, so there's that, I guess. Also, another thing is very much the ongoing sexism in the story. As Maria's curiosity, which, whilst curiosity can be a good or a bad thing, she's shown to be asking lots of questions and wanting to solve the mysteries, but instead she sort of has to wait until a masculine figure gives her permission to. And that, again, really annoyed me, and it's really blatant, because when she's patient, again, she gets answers. And when she is, it's often because it's very much, she is allowed to know the answer instead of, hey, this is a legitimate thing that's happening, I need to know. Like, of course, you shouldn't have to talk about or say information you don't want, but after a point, it's very much a case of there are things about Maria's home that she should probably know. And once again, that moves to Marmaduke Scarlet. So Marmaduke Scarlet is a character who, he is essentially a little person. And he's very much described in sort of fairy-like terminology. And I guess looking back, I think it feels a bit ableist. And whilst obviously because he's a side character, whilst he does have a well-defined personality, the fact of the matter is he's very much sort of like a fairy in the narrative, and that very much, I don't know, I have to admit, as an adult, that feels weird, and unlike other characters in the novel, his backstory is never developed. We get more on Rolf than him. It's never explained why he shares Sir Benjamin's misogyny, which again is never called out by the narrative. It's just shown that Maria, Merryweather, and Loveday are special exceptions. He's never shown to be the misogyny was wrong, just that, oh, I shouldn't have had that bad argument with my cousin fiance. And obviously, talking about Sir Benjamin, this would be a good time to note that the other romantic relationship that bothers me is the one between Loveday and Sir Benjamin. So whilst the idea of essentially meeting an old flame when you're both older, realising what went wrong in your youth, apologising, and essentially spending your twilight years together, isn't necessarily bad, because sometimes people in their youth, when they're old, they do meet old friends and decide that they should spend the twilight years together, is a thing that happens. The history between Sir Benjamin and Loveday is once again a weird feeling, because essentially Loveday, she came to Moonacre Valley when she was about 10 years old, under the care of Sir Benjamin's mother. The two of them didn't get along. However, ever since she was a young girl, she idolised Sir Benjamin, and he in turn cared deeply for her, including carving the furniture in her room. And when she was about 16 or 20, they decided to get married. And he was about 15 years older than her. So, yeah, really, they got married, and on the night of their wedding, they had an argument about geranium flower pots, where Sir Benjamin essentially threw Loveday's prized geraniums out of her window onto the floor all around, and she was so angry she left in a huff, and she decided to essentially marry another man, a lawyer of the people she worked for, Robin's father, just after what happened. So, yeah, that's the love story there. And once again, it's very much framed as, instead of a man doing a violent act towards a woman he's interested in, her outraged reaction at his behaviour is shown as wrong. So it's sort of, plus there is a mention of grooming, or at least what feels like it between them. So it's kind of hard to buy that as a happy ending. Admittedly, they're both older, so they both have lives, so them getting married, getting back together, since Sir Benjamin at the very least in his 60s, Loveday is late 40s, early 50s. That's the impression you get, because I don't think I'm doing the maths right. but never mind. The timeline isn't exactly great in this. That's the other thing, but compared to everything else, is pretty forgivable. So there's that. And so obviously that's another point I don't like, and probably the other one is very much the way the setting is portrayed with Moonacre. It's very much a case where, yes, it's described really lovely, but it's probably just your average lovely village, really, and it's very much tied as a place where you just can't leave, and one of the happiest places in England, when I have to admit, there are reasons why that is the case that would make sense, but it's never really expanded upon by the narration. And look, honestly, I do get the feeling when it's a classic, that was a thing of its time. And like some are classics because they are good. Like anything you read in English language, like Frankenstein. Yes, it's a classic, but there were also, like, let's be real here. There are books that probably came out 10, 20, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, 2000, where, yeah, they might be of historical interest, but to the average person, they're not a great read. So there's that, plus also, from the point of view of this review, is it's basically talking about the things that bother me as an adult and looking back. So I think in summary, I understand why I loved it and why I liked it, but at the same time, there are aspects of the book I didn't challenge, more specifically the way it portrayed romance and faith as this strong, certain thing where everything gets tied back to God, which, whilst that is an attitude that many Christians have, it's not one where any thought of difference or doubt is allowed, and feels oddly evangelical when this is a very firmly Anglican book. So here is my review of The Little White Horse. And I hope you can join me for next week's Off the Shelf video, where it will probably just be a list of Valentine's Day's list of books for Valentine's Day. Bye.